James, Claire, Emily, and Ethan Thompson seemed like the perfect family, well-liked, successful, and respected by everyone in their tight-knit community of Riverton. But one fateful night, their seemingly idyllic lives were shattered in a brutal massacre that left the entire family dead. With no signs of forced entry, no apparent motive, and a web of hidden secrets slowly unraveling, detectives were left with one chilling question: who or what could destroy a family this perfect? The small town of Riverton had always been the epitome of peace. Nestled in the hills, it was the kind of place where neighbours greeted each other with a warm smile, and the pace of life felt slower, almost idyllic. The streets were lined with old oak trees, and the houses, well kept and inviting, spoke of comfort and stability. In this peaceful town, the Thompson family had become the perfect example of suburban bliss. James, the father, was an accountant who spent his days working at a firm downtown. Claire, the mother, was a dedicated schoolteacher who loved her job and her family. Their two children, Emily and Ethan, were high-achieving students who seemed to have everything going for them. They were active in their community, known for their kind hearts and friendly nature. No one would ever have suspected that something so horrific could happen to them, but it did. On the evening of October 14th, the Thompsons were expected at a neighbourhood event, a fall festival at the local park. The air was crisp, and children eagerly waited for the pumpkins to be carved, the games to begin, and the hay rides to start. The entire neighbourhood was buzzing with excitement. But when the festival began, the Thompsons were nowhere to be seen. At first, it was assumed they were running late, but when the hours passed and they still hadn't arrived, their friends began to worry. Claire had been excited about the event, and James was never one to miss an opportunity to spend time with his kids. The family was always punctual, so it was strange that they hadn't shown up. A few calls were made, but no one answered. Eventually, the concern grew too large to ignore, and the police were called. When the officers arrived at the Thompson residence, they found the front door slightly ajar. It wasn't locked, a peculiar detail, since the family had always been careful about security. Inside, the house was unnervingly quiet. The lights were on in the living room, and everything appeared to be in its place, but there was a chilling stillness in the air. The officers carefully moved through the house, calling out for anyone who might be there. They found nothing. It wasn't until they reached the upstairs bedrooms that the horror unfolded. In the master bedroom, they found James and Claire, lifeless, and sprawled across the bed in unnatural positions. Their bodies were cold, the air around them thick with the smell of death. But the most disturbing thing was the utter lack of any signs of struggle. There were no broken windows, no signs of forced entry. The house was undisturbed in a way that seemed more unsettling than if it had been ransacked. The children's rooms, too, were eerily quiet. Emily and Ethan were found in their beds, each of them hidden under the covers, as though they had been tucked in for the night. They looked peaceful at first glance, but a closer look revealed the truth. They had been brutally murdered, their lives taken without warning or apparent reason. The scene was a grisly puzzle. Why had this happened? The entire family wiped out with no obvious motive and the house left untouched. The officers were left with more questions than answers. And as they began their investigation, they realized that the mystery of the Thompson family's death would be far more complicated than anyone could have anticipated. As the days passed, the investigation into the Thompson family's deaths grew more perplexing. There were no signs of forced entry into the house, no blood or physical evidence left behind by the killer, and nothing seemed to have been stolen. The family's valuables were still present. Expensive jewelry, cash, and electronics were left untouched. The scene was too clean, too methodical. It didn't resemble a typical burglary gone wrong or a crime of passion. It felt more like an execution, but with no obvious reason for such brutality. The police began by interviewing the neighbors, hoping to gather any insight that might explain the tragedy. The Thompsons had always been well liked in the community. James and Claire were both friendly and active in neighborhood events. Their children were well-mannered, polite, and known for their academic achievements. No one could think of a single person who would want to harm them, and yet, here they were, dead in their own home. In the absence of any clear leads, detectives turned their attention to the family's personal lives. The investigation into their finances revealed something unsettling. James had accumulated significant debt over the past few years. It wasn't common knowledge in the neighborhood, and neither James nor Claire had ever mentioned it. The debts seemed to stem from a series of bad investments and gambling losses. The more the police dug, the more they found evidence that James had been secretly battling financial ruin. It seemed that the Thompsons' seemingly perfect life had been built on a shaky foundation of lies. Further investigation into James's finances uncovered something even more troubling. A private investigator had been hired by James several months before his death. The private investigator's records revealed that James had been looking into threats made by a man named Victor, though the details of their interactions were unclear. The investigator couldn't provide much information, only that James had paid for his services to track down this Victor, someone who appeared to be connected to James's financial troubles. Victor's identity remained a mystery, but the name seemed to resonate with something darker. A shadowy figure that had somehow crept into the family's life. Was Victor the one behind the murders? As detectives followed this lead, they discovered that James had been making increasingly desperate calls to a local pawn shop, where he had been pawning off family heirlooms and other possessions to cover his mounting debts. Claire, who had always been the steady, supportive wife, seemed to have no idea about the full extent of James's financial troubles. She had been under the impression that they were managing their money carefully. The two had kept these secrets from each other, and it was becoming clear that James's hidden problems might have played a role in what had happened. But still, it didn't explain the complete annihilation of the family. If someone had been after James for money, why not just target him? Why take the entire family? As the investigation deepened, it became clear that something even more insidious was at play. The police found messages in Claire's email inbox that revealed a disturbing connection. She had been in contact with someone named Richard, an old acquaintance from her past, a man she had dated before meeting James. Their communication had been sporadic, but the tone of the messages was troubling. Claire had expressed concern about a man named Victor, whom she had apparently known long before the recent investigation began. Victor wasn't just someone James had been worried about. He was a man Claire had been trying to distance herself from for years. The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. Richard had been part of Claire's life long before her marriage to James. The emails between Claire and Richard hinted at a deeper, darker connection. Richard had been reaching out to Claire in recent months, trying to reconnect. The timing was too suspicious. Could this be the person who had been influencing the events leading up to the massacre? And what did Victor have to do with it all? The investigation now had more questions than answers. As the puzzle pieces slowly began to come together, the detectives realized that the Thompsons' deaths weren't just the result of a random act of violence. There were ties to the past, secrets buried deep beneath the surface, and a chain of events that had been set into motion long before that fateful night. But one crucial detail remained elusive. Who was Victor, and how had he played a role in the slaughter of the Thompson family? The search for answers was only beginning. As the investigation continued, the police began to feel the weight of the mystery pressing down on them. The discovery of Claire's emails with Richard and the unsettling connection to a man named Victor had opened a new line of inquiry, but it only led to more questions. No one seemed to know who Victor really was, or why he might have been involved with the Thompsons. It felt like they were chasing shadows, and every lead seemed to only deepen the confusion. The first breakthrough came when investigators re-examined the surveillance footage from the night of the murders. A few houses down from the Thompson residence, the Parkers, an elderly couple who had lived on the street for decades, reported hearing strange sounds coming from the Thompson house the night before the murders. The sounds had been muffled, but they seemed like the unmistakable noise of arguing voices, loud enough to carry through the thin walls between the homes. The Parkers recalled hearing a man's voice, but they couldn't identify who it was. It was unusual for the Thompsons to have visitors so late in the evening, especially during the week, so the sounds were out of character. Could this have been a sign that something had gone wrong the night before the murders? The police decided to investigate further. They spoke with the Parkers again, asking if they had noticed anything else suspicious. The elderly couple admitted they had heard the argument around 10 p.m., but hadn't thought much of it at the time. By the time the officers pressed them for more details, the memory of the incident had become somewhat blurred. But the fact remained that someone had been in the house that night, and the argument might have been the catalyst for what happened the following day. This discovery prompted the detectives to look more closely at the Thompsons' interactions on the night of the murders. They interviewed neighbours who had seen James and Claire in the late afternoon, smiling and chatting casually with people on their way home from work. It seemed like any other day, but what had happened after they went inside? Had they been aware that someone was coming for them? Were they caught off guard? Or was there something they knew, something they had been hiding? The police began to focus on Richard, the man Claire had been in contact with. They brought him in for questioning, but his answers were evasive, and his alibi for the night of the murders seemed too convenient. He claimed that he had been at home with his girlfriend, but when investigators looked into his whereabouts that evening, they found inconsistencies. His phone records showed that he had called Claire several times in the days leading up to the murders, but he denied speaking with her. What did he know about the events that had unfolded? The biggest break in the case came when the investigators found something unexpected in Richard's car. A piece of torn clothing, which appeared to be a shirt, was found in the back seat. The fabric was covered in what appeared to be traces of blood. Richard claimed he had no idea how it got there, but the blood samples were sent to the lab for analysis. The results were shocking. The blood was a match for one of the Thompson family members. It wasn't Claire's, but it was close. It belonged to Emily, the younger daughter. This discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. If Richard had been involved in the deaths, he had to have known the family well enough to get close to them, and the presence of Emily's blood in his car was damning evidence. But the question remained, why would Richard be involved in the murders of an entire family? Was he acting alone, or was there someone else behind this horrific crime? As the detectives pressed Richard for more information, they were left with more troubling revelations. Richard's connection to the Thompsons was not as simple as it had initially seemed. He wasn't just an old acquaintance of Claire's. He had deeper ties to the family's secrets. The more they uncovered, the more it became clear that Richard was hiding something. But what could it be? Was he really the key to solving the case, or was he simply a pawn in a much larger game? The investigation now seemed to be at a crossroads. Richard's involvement in the case was undeniable, but the true mastermind behind the slaughter remained elusive. The mysterious figure named Victor, who had been linked to both Claire's past and James's financial troubles, had to be at the center of the web. But who was Victor, and how did he pull Richard into this web of deceit and violence? The answers seemed just out of reach, leaving the detectives to wonder how much darker the truth would get as they continued their search for the real killer. As the investigation grew more intense, the police began to focus on Richard with renewed suspicion. The discovery of Emily's blood in his car was the key piece of evidence they had been waiting for, but it wasn't enough to fully connect him to the murders. Richard had denied involvement from the start, claiming that he had no idea how the blood had ended up in his vehicle, but his story was beginning to unravel. Richard had been brought in for further questioning, and the detectives could feel the pressure mounting on him. He had been an old acquaintance of Claire's, but the connection between them was far deeper than anyone had realized. Claire had tried to distance herself from Richard after they had broken up years ago, but he had kept reaching out, trying to reconnect. The more they delved into his background, the more troubling details came to light. Richard had been involved in some shady dealings in the past, including gambling debts and connections to a network of people who were not to be trusted. Could his financial problems have been the motive for the murders? Was he desperate enough to be drawn into something far darker? It wasn't until the police dug deeper into Richard's recent activities that they discovered something truly chilling. Richard had been in Riverton just days before the murders, though he had told the police he had been out of town. His alibi had started to fall apart, and the timeline of events was starting to make less and less sense. The detectives began to piece together a horrifying picture. Richard had been in town not only the day before the murders, but also the night of the killings. Surveillance footage from a gas station in town showed Richard's car driving past the area late that evening. But it wasn't alone. There was someone else in the car with him, someone who was wearing a dark hoodie, their face obscured by the shadows of the night. The footage wasn't clear enough to make a positive ID, but it was enough to suggest that Richard had not been alone when he drove by the Thompson house. Could this mysterious person have been involved in the murders? The police began to ask more questions about the mysterious figure. The name Victor surfaced again and again during their investigation into the family's finances and personal history. Victor had been the person James had been investigating, the person whom Claire had been trying to escape. It seemed that Victor's influence over Richard had been far greater than anyone had imagined. It was starting to look like Richard had been manipulated, coerced by Victor into helping carry out the gruesome massacre. But why would Victor want to eliminate the Thompsons? The deeper the detectives went, the more they realized that Victor wasn't just some anonymous criminal. He had a personal vendetta against the Thompson family. Victor had been involved in a string of illegal activities, some of which tied directly to James's financial troubles. James had borrowed money from dangerous people, and Victor had been the one pulling the strings behind the scenes. When James failed to repay the debts, Victor had threatened not only him, but also his entire family. Richard had been drawn into this web of threats, his own debts and criminal past making him vulnerable to manipulation. Richard's involvement in the murders was becoming clearer, but there was one more piece of the puzzle that the police needed to uncover. They needed to know who the person in the car with him was, and whether they had any role in the killings. The timeline was beginning to match up. Richard had been in the area the night of the murders, and he had been connected to Victor. The question now was how far the conspiracy went. Had Richard been acting alone, or had Victor orchestrated the entire thing from the shadows, pulling the strings and ensuring that everything went according to plan? The mystery of Victor's true identity remained unsolved, and Richard, despite his increasing involvement, continued to deny any knowledge of the killer's whereabouts. But it was becoming apparent that Richard wasn't the only person responsible for the deaths of the Thompson family. Victor's influence had shaped the events leading up to the massacre, but the true extent of his involvement remained a chilling unknown. It seemed as though the closer the police came to finding answers, the more they uncovered a tangled web of lies, manipulation, and danger. But until they found Victor, the full story would remain elusive. The chilling question remained: could they ever catch the shadowy figure who had masterminded this horrific crime? The investigation reached a critical turning point as Richard's involvement became undeniable, but the true mastermind behind the massacre, the elusive Victor, remained at large. Richard's involvement was clear enough to warrant his arrest, yet the deeper the police dug, the more it became apparent that he was more of a pawn in a far more complex game. The blood in his car, the suspicious alibi, and the connections to Victor painted a grim picture, but they still didn't explain why the entire Thompson family had to be killed. What had driven Victor to such extreme lengths, and why had Richard been dragged into the conspiracy? Victor's name had appeared in several different parts of the investigation, but there was still little to go on when it came to identifying him. He seemed to be a shadow, a figure who had never left a trace, yet whose influence was powerful, enough to manipulate Richard and drive him to commit murder. He was tied to the financial ruin James had faced, and it became clear that the debts and threats that had plagued the family were not just financial. Victor had made sure they were personal too. James's failure to repay the money had caused him to spiral into desperation, and it appeared that he had made a dangerous enemy in the process. Victor had been a constant threat looming over their heads, and his presence had shaped every aspect of the family's downfall. The next breakthrough came when the police, following up on a hunch, checked surveillance footage from a nearby town. It was a grainy recording from a gas station camera, but it was enough to show a man fitting Victor's description, a tall, broad-shouldered figure wearing a hoodie and dark sunglasses, at a rest stop about 50 miles from Riverton, just days after the murders. The man had entered the store and purchased a drink, paying with cash and leaving in a hurry. He had appeared nervous, glancing over his shoulder as he walked to his car. The car was registered under a name that didn't seem to belong to anyone in Riverton, and when the investigators traced it, they found a lead that sent chills down their spines. The car had been linked to a known criminal organization, one with ties to organized crime and money laundering. The connection was clear. Victor wasn't just some local debt collector. He was part of something much larger, something far more dangerous. By now, Richard was cooperating with the investigation, though he had yet to fully admit his role in the murders. He was terrified, but his fear didn't seem to be just of the law. It was of Victor, who was still out there, still a looming threat. Richard finally confessed to his part in the murders, explaining that he had been blackmailed by Victor into helping carry out the killings. Victor had threatened him, using his criminal connections to make sure Richard would comply, and had promised that if he didn't, both Richard and his family would be killed as well. Richard had been caught in a deadly trap, an innocent man, caught up in a world of threats and manipulation he couldn't escape. Despite his confession, the police were no closer to finding Victor. Richard had led them to a few potential leads, but each time they seemed to be on the verge of catching him, he slipped away. It was as if Victor had always been one step ahead, leaving no trace of himself behind. The longer the investigation dragged on, the more hopeless it seemed. Richard was arrested and charged with the murders, but he remained a reluctant and terrified participant in the larger story. The real question remained: who was Victor, and how had he been able to orchestrate the deaths of the entire Thompson family with such cold precision? Months passed, and despite the best efforts of law enforcement, Victor remained at large. He seemed to vanish without a trace, and each lead the investigators followed seemed to dry up. The town of Riverton, once a place of peace and quiet, was forever changed. The families who lived there no longer felt safe, and the memories of the Thompsons, once a shining example of the perfect suburban family, were now overshadowed by the horror of their deaths. The police had their suspect in Richard, but the bigger question, why the Thompsons had been chosen and who had truly orchestrated the massacre, was still left unanswered. In the end, the case was never fully solved. Victor's true identity remained a mystery, and his whereabouts were unknown. The unanswered questions left a haunting gap in the investigation, a reminder that even in the most peaceful of places, darkness can lurk just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike. The Thompson family's murder would forever remain an open wound in Riverton, and the shadow of Victor's presence would haunt the town for years to come. The truth, it seemed, would never fully be revealed.